My kids would have a comment about that. I have 2 teenage sons. Okay, well, thank you all I'm going to take this. Is that better? Okay, I felt like maybe you couldn't hear me. Thank you all for coming out on this icy, cold Sunday, midday, on Super Bowl Sunday. I mean, I am honored that you made the effort instead of staying at home making dips and other things. As I will watch a little football, I admit it, but I would always rather be reading a book. But don't tell my teenage boys that. Well, I am just delighted to be here with you all, especially in these circumstances, of course, and thrilled to be talking to you about some of my books, but mostly about the Queens of Crime. It was such a delight. I drove in here from Pittsburgh, where I did my first launch event and where I'm from this morning, and your town is so cute. I'm sure you guys hear that a lot. But I have to say, it reminds me, I live in a historic town too, and there aren't too many of them out there, right? That have a town center that you can walk to, and I just love the feel of it. So it felt a little bit like coming home this morning, and I wanted to thank you for that. I am delighted to be launching the Queens of Crime with you all. You guys may or may not know this, but the book doesn't officially come out till Tuesday. So it's our little secret. If you do get it today, you will be reading it long before anybody else does. And if you enjoy it, share the word. So what is the Queens of Crime about? It is about the 5 greatest women writers in the golden age of mystery. Focusing in on one woman in particular, Dorothy Sayers. This is not a quiz, but I do have to ask, has anybody in here heard of Dorothy Sayers? Oh my gosh, that's a lot of you. Last night it was like crickets. I couldn't believe it. So thank you. This book, as I said, is about these 5 incredible women writers, and also their bid to solve a real-life murder. The book fits squarely within my mission. If you're familiar with any of my other books, you know, and thank you for nodding. That was so cute. I'm kind of a mission-driven writer, which isn't always true. I really have this goal to excavate from the past the most important and complex and hopefully fascinating women of history and shining the light on them. Shining the light on their lives, and their legacies and their accomplishments, so we can better understand the role that they played and that, honestly, they continue to play in our lives. Thank you for clapping for that. Would you like to come on tour with me? And I'll just plant you in the audience, and we'll start clapping. For those of you who've been kind enough to read some of my other books, you see some of them here. There's The Other Einstein, which is about Albert Einstein's first wife, and the role she played in his miracle year when he produced 5 of the world's most important physics theories. I think we know who was partially responsible. The Only Woman in the Room, which is about the engineering marvel created by Hedy Lamarr, and that became Wi-Fi. Most people thought a screen goddess couldn't do that. But of course, we know that women can be brilliant and beautiful at the same time. The Personal Librarian, which really explores the unique life and legacy of J.P. Morgan's librarian, Belle DaCosta Green. And The Mystery of Mrs. Christie, among them, which highlights the rise and the travails of the most successful novelist of all time. I'm going to say it again. The most successful novelist of all time, which is Agatha Christie. And I like to, highlight this one because Agatha Christie is a character in my new book as well. She makes a very important reappearance. So, despite the fact that The Queens of Crime is very much in keeping with my other novels, it is also something entirely new. And what do I mean by that? What do I mean by this difference? So these women that I'm talking about tonight, these 5 best golden age of mystery writers, Together we're known as the Queens of Crime, hence the title for the book. But what was this golden age of mystery, for those of you who aren't familiar with it? Well, it took place in the 1920s and 30s, and it was really the beginning of the creation of what we think of today as the classic murder mystery. Obviously, Agatha Christie, at least that's who I think of when I think about these sorts of stories. But it's also, for those of you who aren't as familiar with her books, think the board game Clue or Knives Out, the movie. And many of the best writers of this canon emerged from this time period, from this golden age of mystery, or were inspired by it. And these women writers, these queens of crime, included Agatha Christie, who I obviously mentioned. The other that I mentioned that some of you kept your hands up for, Dorothy Sayers, and 3 other women that we're going to talk about a little more today. And these 5 women bucked convention to attain success in a very male-dominated space. And what they did was really help fashion this genre, which obviously is still incredibly popular today, maybe even more so. And many of these women's characters and books live on in our society and our culture today, even if we don't know the authors' names anymore, which I think should be rectified, but we'll get to that. So when I finally decided to write a story about these queens of crime, it seemed to me that the best way to honor their stories and their legacies would be to bend the historical fiction genre that I usually write in a little bit. So in the Queens of Crime, I do blend my usual historical fiction with elements of classic mystery and even aspects of true crime, which I'll talk about. And to me, this seemed the perfect vehicle, almost an irresistible vehicle, for Dorothy Sayers and the Queens of Crime. As these women come together as friends and, as you'll see, detectives, they seek justice for themselves and others as they solve a real-life murder. But let's back up a second. How did I decide upon the queen? I have to take this wrap off, people. I'm sorry. It's driving me insane. How did I decide upon writing the Queens of Crime and Dorothy Sayers really in the first place? And how did I uncover the actual mystery, which is at the heart of the book? And I start here because honestly, that's usually the first question I get asked. People seem to be, and it's it's so flattering. People seem to be very interested in how I find these women, how I kind of cobble together these stories. So I thought I'd start there. I'd long been familiar with the golden age of mystery writers, and that's largely because of my beloved Aunt Terry. Now, I do talk about her a lot, so if you've ever heard me speak, you might have heard me mention her. And she really was so instrumental to my life. She was an English professor, she was a poet, and she was a rebellious nun. For those of you who don't know really what that is, please feel free to ask me afterwards. But I will say, for the very first time last night at an event, one of the guests came up to me and said, "I have something to tell you." And I said, "What?" And she said, "I'm a rebellious nun, too." And I was like, okay, we'll get into that. But anyway, I was so fortunate to have my Aunt Terry for many reasons. But one of them was that I was that crazy, voracious reader kid. I was that kid that was always holed up looking for a moment of peace. I was the oldest of 6 kids. I was really looking for peace. And I always had my nose in a book. And my aunt was the one who kept me in books. And she gave me so many instrumental volumes that even today I look back and think how they were crucial in who I became today. But for the purposes of today, I thought I'd share with you some of the books that she gave me. And during the Christmases of my youth, it's really starting in middle school, she started to gift me books by Golden Age of Mystery authors. So I have a huge collection of Agatha Christie that I've been reading forever, and she also gave me Dorothy Sayers. So I really have grown up with these books. I've grown up loving the tricky puzzles at the heart of these stories. I've grown up loving the interwar period, that really important stretch between World War I and World War II, where many of these novels are set. And so even though I was familiar with these writers and kind of always had in my mind a fascination with them and their stories in this time period, the spark for my book, The Queens of Crime, actually started when I was doing research for another novel that I wrote, The Mystery of Mrs. Christie. Here's the book, and here's Agatha Christie as you probably think of her, if indeed you do think of her, which is probably less often than I think of her. So I'm just going to toss that out there. So this book is about really this Agatha Christie. This is a young Agatha Christie. And the book is my fictional take on what happened to Agatha during this famous or infamous 11-day disappearance. So she disappeared in 1926 in really some crazy circumstances. She was eventually found, again, in crazy circumstances. And her vanishing led to the largest manhunt in England's history. It was like a paparazzi blitz. And I just had a sense, of having kind of grown up on Agatha Christie, that a woman as brilliant as Agatha in the art of plotting, she maybe had a hand in her own vanishing. I just had a sense of things. And so I really went deep into the research about Agatha. I grew up knowing all these women and their books, but I didn't know the women behind the books. And as I was learning more about Agatha's life, I started to learn more about her very close friend, one of her best friends, Dorothy Sayers. And I learned that actually, this is a young Dorothy Sayers, that she was actually called into this nationwide effort to try and find Agatha. The police, the authorities actually contacted Dorothy. They had her come out and do her own examination of Agatha's abandoned car. She was considered expert enough to actually engage in her own detective work. And I just started to think, who is this woman that the police are calling in for help? And I started to become more and more curious about Dorothy along with Agatha. So I went down the rabbit hole, and that is where I like to live. Occasionally I surface into my rather ordinary current life, but I spend a lot of time in archives and in research. And as I mentioned, I had been familiar with Agatha's books, obviously. Dorothy's books. I knew that during her lifetime, especially during the 1930s, she was nearly as popular as Agatha for her mystery novels. Most people don't realize that today. Dorothy had written a series starring this gentleman detective called Lord Peter Wimsey. And unusual for the time, he had a sidekick who then becomes something more, which again we can discuss. And her name was Harriet Vane, and she was not just your average detective, she was also a mystery writer herself. And I have to say, the more I looked into her, the more I learned about Dorothy's life. I really do think Harriet Vane is a stand-in for Dorothy Sayers. There's a hugely autobiographical component to Harriet Vane. And I think that's really important. It has been important for me in understanding Dorothy Sayers. And I knew that Dorothy's books were ahead of their time. In her books, she explores themes that certainly were forward for her time, but are actually things that we're still talking about today. Things like how you can achieve a work-life balance. We haven't figured that one out, obviously. Whether or not you can have an equitable marriage. How to find work that is really your calling. All these issues that, really weren't being discussed among women at her time period, she's thinking about, and she's sort of embedding in her different stories. These issues really come to a crescendo in this book, Gaudy Night, which is considered to be her masterpiece. If you ever see a list like in Time Magazine or Forbes, one of those publications, about the best mystery novels of all time, this book is always on it. I mean, it's really considered really crucial in the canon. And this book really overtly tackles a lot of these issues. And so it had always kind of seemed to me that Dorothy Sayers was an author who was ripe for rediscovery. Also, when I was doing my research about Dorothy, I learned a couple other nuggets about her. For one of which is that she was one of the very first women to get a degree from Cambridge University in England, which is like their Harvard. So I thought that was amazing. And she also, sort of at the same time she was writing novels, she was also had an advertising career. Again, very few women in the field. And she actually, she did almost all of Guinness's advertising that lives on to today. If you've ever heard the phrase, Guinness is good for you, that's Dorothy Sayers. The Guinness toucan and all these emblems that they use in their advertising, that's Dorothy Sayers, all her. So, she was really a success and formidable in her own right, even outside of her writing, which was what she loved to do. So amidst all that, Dorothy decides that she wants to help form something called the Detection Club in 1930. This is a little blurry, but this is one of their annual dinners. And what the Detection Club was a gathering of the brightest and best and most successful mystery novelists of the time. And Dorothy wanted these writers to come together for a couple of reasons. First, for support. Right? Second, to help elevate their craft. During this time period, there was a huge variation in quality among mystery novels. And mystery and detective novelists were also always being critiqued for coming up with fanciful resolutions to their books that had no logical basis. She wanted to help correct that, help even that out. She wanted to elevate the craft to such a level that they would start to receive the same kind of recognition and literary and critical acclaim that other forms of literature were receiving, but that they were not. And so she got together, I think it was close to 20 or 30 in the first group you see here, of the best mystery novelists of the day. It included people like Anthony Berkeley, A.A. Milne, and this gentleman, G.K. Chesterton, who you may have heard of. He was the first president. You probably don't know his name, but if you've ever watched the Father Brown mysteries on PBS or BBC, that's him. And what's interesting about this, and I think really telling, is that, and we'll get to this, but many of these mystery novelists, you don't know their names anymore, but their characters have lived on in adaptations. So the club used to get together, and one of the things that Dorothy created, which I just love, this is just a little vignette for you guys, but she created all of these fanciful rituals for the Detection Club to engage in as a way to kind of knit them together. And so she had this elaborate initiation ceremony where people wore black robes and carried candelabra, and then had to swear on a skull that, and this is not a human skull, this is theatrical, it's not real, but it did look good. They had to swear that they would solve their fictional crimes without divine revelation, mumbo jumbo, coincidence, or act of God. So I just love that. That's very Dorothy Sayers. Within the Detection Club, I learned that there were 5 women. Obviously, Dorothy Sayers, she's one of the founders, but also, of course, Agatha Christie. And this is a young Agatha Christie. This is what she would have looked like around this time period. We think of her in one way. We think of her as the gray-haired matron sipping tea in her English countryside estate, penning like these crazy murder mysteries, but she was really, a very textured, nuanced person. And this is her around that time period. And of course, Dorothy Sayers. These two were 2 of these 5 women. The 2 other women, or 3, excuse me, I've never really been good at math. The 3 other women include, there's Dorothy again. Why do I keep showing her? Ngaio Marsh. Ngaio Marsh was a New Zealander. Has anyone heard of her? Okay, very nice. A couple people. That makes me so happy. Ngaio Marsh was famous for her Inspector Roderick Allen series. They love these gentleman detectives. He was a gentleman detective. He worked for the Metropolitan Police. And in fact, this is another one of those examples that you'll hear with all of these women. Inspector Allen is somebody who has had a PBS or BBC adaptation. Ngaio Marsh had a bold personality. She loved to stride through the streets in her pantsuits, raising eyebrows. She was known for her sharp wit, and she's just such a great, great character. The fourth, if my math is right, fourth queen of crime is Margery Allingham. Has anyone heard of Margery? Okay, 1, 2, yes, 3, couple of hands. I feel like I'm running an auction. Do I have 1? Do I have 2? She was the youngest of the group. She was like the quintessential English young woman. She was the daughter of 2 writers, maybe a little more retiring in the company of some of these bigger personalities. But she wrote the Albert Campion mysteries. Again, Campion is adapted on PBS. All of these women's characters are still out there today, but we just have lost their names, which hopefully will change. The 5th is this character, Baroness Emma Orczy. She was a Hungarian aristocrat, and she was the creator of the first dual identity hero called the Scarlet Pimpernel. Does anyone know? Listen to that reaction. Everybody knows the Scarlet Pimpernel. For those of you who don't, he was an English aristocrat who used to dress up with a mask by night and save French aristocrats from the guillotine. Did I summarize that all right? Okay. But really, that character is the basis for every superhero that came down the pike. So when you think of like Clark Kent and Superman, like the idea for the seed for that was planted with her. She also wrote mystery series. And she had a very different personality from the others again. She had this romantic nature and this dramatic personality. So what I loved about these queens of crime is that they were so different. They came from different continents. They came within a limited range of different socioeconomic strata, which was unusual for the time. People usually kept within their own strata during this time period. They had different interests, different personalities. They were different ages. The thing that united them was their skills and their love of mystery writing. And I loved the idea of exploring this really strong and intense female friendship bridging across different types of people and ages. There came a point when these 5 women, oops, that's too fast, sorry, they felt as though they weren't being properly recognized by the other folks in the detection club. And they had their own little club within a club, and they would meet and talk about the crimes of the day and try and solve them. They would help work on each other's projects. They would support each other. But they felt like maybe it wasn't a two-way street with the other members of the club. And they wanted to find a way to prove themselves to the rest of the detection club in the world at large. But this was tricky because, these women were already best-selling novelists. I mean, they shouldn't have to prove themselves, but if they felt they were going to have to prove themselves, what could they do? And this was the moment for me that the story that I wrote in The Queens of Crime really coalesced. And it was really the moment that, in some ways, the novel was born. My interest in these women in this time period was there. Because, you see, it was around this time when I learned that Dorothy had actually investigated a real-life murder. She had already acted as a detective, and not just in Agatha's disappearance. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to have the other 4 queens of crime join her in that undertaking? Instead of writing about detectives, what if they became detectives? Wouldn't this be really the optimal way for them to prove themselves as like the preeminent mystery writers? I mean, who could poo-poo them if they had already solved a real crime? So what was this real crime that Dorothy was involved in? Well, Dorothy's husband, this is him, Mac Fleming, he was a journalist for a publication called The News of the World. His beats were car racing and crime. I'm going to leave you guys to connect the dots on what those could be. I'm not sure. And one day and this is where they lived in London. I always love to show little images like that so you can picture where they lived. This was their building in London where they lived for many years. And one day, his Mac's editor offered him an assignment to cover the high-profile story. You can see it here, I think. This might be a better one up here. These are real newspaper articles. I don't know if you can see them. His assignment was to cover the high-profile story of a young British nurse who disappeared from the French seaside town of Boulogne in in locked room circumstances that seemed torn from the pages of the women's novels. Nurse May Daniels had taken a day trip on one of her rare days off from her hospital in England to seaside France, and she'd been accompanied by a fellow nurse and friend, Celia McCarthy. They'd had a wonderful day in Boulogne, and then minutes before they were about to board the ferry to return, May stepped into a restroom. It was a restroom that had a single door that operated as both the exit and the entrance. There were no windows, no vents, nothing else in the restroom that would allow you to leave the space. Celia waited outside the restroom for her friend. I mean, May had the tickets. She wasn't letting her go anywhere. And she waited, and May never stepped out. She seemingly vanished into thin air. Now, obviously, the extraordinary nature of this, here's about May Daniels' friend. The extraordinary nature of this disappearance yielded a flurry of press interest, right, at first. And this died down when May didn't surface for months. Then her body was found, unfortunately, in the woods, not too far from the Boulogne dock where she had originally disappeared. Initially, they weren't sure how she'd been killed, and then it seemed as though perhaps she'd been strangled. She had other wounds in her body, and the press was whipped into a frenzy again at this new development, and a gaggle of journalists descended onto Boulogne to cover this strange crime and write a slew of articles. And these are just some of the ones that I've read. I've read hundreds of these articles. There's so many of them. Let me see where this one is. I Killed May Daniels. I mean, they're just countless articles about this. And it really served as an incredible source of research for me for a number of reasons that I'll talk about. But Boulogne really became a circus for a while when this happened. And this is when the time period when Mac was invited to go to Boulogne to cover the story. In real life, when Mac got this assignment, Dorothy had a light bulb go off over her head, and she proposed that she join her husband in the newspaper coverage of this murder. Maybe, she said, we could write companion pieces for the news of the world. We'll do an investigation. I'll write it from the perspective of a crime fiction writer, and you write it from the perspective of a crime journalist. And Mac's editor loved the story idea. And so he sent them out to join this journalistic circus for a while, and the two set out to try and find out what happened to May Daniels. Now, in the Queens of Crime, people always ask me what's fact and what's fiction. The other Queens of Crime didn't really join them in real life, I'm sorry to say. I would have loved to have been a fly on the ferry watching that happen. But in my book, I do have the 4 other mystery writers join Dorothy in this undertaking. Now, this wouldn't have actually been a strange thing to actually happen. These women worked on, as I mentioned, they worked on each other's work. They actually collaborated on short story collections. I mean, they spent a lot of time together. They spent time parsing together crimes of the day, trying to figure them out. And most likely, Dorothy would have discussed this murder with these women. That's the kind of relationship that they had. So in my book, secretly, so as not to alert Mac that she's doing it, when Dorothy and her husband Mac set out on a ferry to go to Boulogne, the 4 queens of crime have accompanied them, unbeknownst to poor, unsuspecting Mac, which is a whole other story in itself. When they arrived in Boulogne, this is what it would have looked like around that time period. When they arrived in Boulogne, a Boulogne overrun with reporters, Dorothy and her 4 friends kind of slip off, right? They begin their own investigation into what happened to May Daniels. And this is an investigation I really modeled on Dorothy's own investigation. They decide to take a very different approach than the authorities have taken, than the other journalists who were all male had taken. And then painstakingly, over the next few days, the Queens of Crime retrace the path that May and her friend Celia McCarthy took on the day of May's disappearance. They piece together the places that May and Celia went, and they see Boulogne through these young women's eyes. This is kind of what the town looked like in some of the major sites. They go to the cafes and the shops and the harbor and the bakeries, all the places that these young women went during this day. And then they do something that the authorities hadn't done, that the other journalists hadn't done. They talk to the women of Boulogne. They talk to the waitresses and the pharmacy assistants and the shopkeepers and the milliners, all the women that May and Celia would have encountered during this day abroad, but women who were mostly ignored by the police and by the reporters. And of course, that's where they find the clues. That's where clues and evidence that has really been hidden in plain sight, but has been overlooked or underestimated, starts to be revealed. And then these women, this is like a historic map of Boulogne that I found that it was just invaluable for tracing all their movements of these days. These women, the five queens, start to traipse back and forth between France and England, trying to pursue May's killer. And to do that, they have to make sense of May's life. They have to know her work and her friends and her family and her secrets, of which there are many. And these women, the five queens, they have secrets of their own, which really do come into play. These five incredibly disparate, big personality women learn so much about themselves as they go through this process. And one of the things that they learn is all the different skills and experiences that the others have. These women largely knew each other in a professional sense up until this time, supporters of each other's work, certainly, but mostly colleagues. And they become much, much more as they undertake this investigation. They also, here they are. I love this picture of them. Aren't they fabulous? I mean, don't you wish these clothes would come back? But that's a whole other story. These women persist in trying to solve the case, even when the authorities, the French and the English authorities, both of which who had been investigating the crime, when they can't or won't. Because what happens in a short time after these women become involved, the authorities stop investigating May's murder. Not because they found the killer, mind you. Instead, they latch onto these incendiary characterizations of this poor young woman. If you read those newspaper articles that I point out, and many, many more of them, you'll see descriptions of her as having bobbed hair, shingled hair. And when we think about the 1920s and early 30s, we think about that as just, a cute hairstyle. That's not what that meant. When you see that in a newspaper article at that time, that's code for a loose woman. A girl who had shingled or bobbed hair, she was modern. And a modern woman maybe had loose morals. And so the authorities latched onto that as another reason for why maybe didn't really deserve a full investigation. When they were, kind of scouring the woods, not right near, in the larger woods of where her body was found, they found a syringe. And yeah, of course, because there's a syringe somewhere near her body, she must be a drug addict. Another reason why maybe we just will deploy our police to other issues, right? Probably the biggest excuse to abandon the search for May's killer, what really fueled the flame of this bias against her was the fact that the society considered May to be what's called a surplus woman. Are you guys familiar with that term? I had never heard it until I started doing this research. This was a completely new facet of history to me, and I do always love finding those. A surplus woman was considered an excess woman. Sometimes you'll see newspaper headlines, surplus woman, excess woman. I'm like, why would anybody be an excess? What does that even mean? And what it meant at the time was it was a group or a population of unmarried women in this interwar period who were working. And because the primary view of this time period was that women should be in the home, with husbands and families, not out in the workforce, right? Never mind that most of these women were working because there were very few men to marry, right? In the wake of World War I, there was a very slender population of young men for them to marry, right? It wasn't even a choice on these women's part. And yet they were reviled for going out into the workplace, having jobs like a nurse, right, to support themselves when nobody else was going to support them. These women were in an impossible position, as you can imagine, and May Daniels was one such woman. She was an unmarried young nurse. We don't know whether she chose that path or whether that was the only path available to her. Regardless, she was judged for it. But the queens of crime, these ladies weren't going to have any of that, right? They pushed ahead when no one else would. Even when their sleuthing forced them to confront really some dark aspects of really the highest levels of British society and reveal really unpleasant truths, which I'm sorry about in advance. Even when the killer targets Dorothy herself, threatening to expose this dark, very real secret that Dorothy had buried in her past, that would have completely upended her life if it became known, the women still persisted. And these 5 powerhouse women, who I love, discover that they're stronger and smarter together, and they really become an unassailable unit as they pursue justice on May's behalf. And they really discover that solving this crime is much more important than proving themselves to their detection club members. They learn that banded together, this group of female friends really had the power to secure justice, even if it wasn't by what we'll call traditional means. You'll have to read to figure out what I mean by that. And I have to confess that I found it super satisfying to provide closure and justice for May in my book, even if it's only through fiction, And I hope that the Queens of Crime example in this story can really serve as an inspiration for us. We aren't limited in the good we can do in the world, but by what society tells us we can do, right? We have so much more at our fingertips. Interestingly, as I pieced together the story, not just of these 5 fabulous women, but of May Daniels, I used some of Dorothy's own novels as my trail of clues. Without giving too much away, it's kind of hard to dance around this without doing spoilers, because I know you all are going to read it. I think that real-life Dorothy, like all the other queens, was always seeking justice, right? I think she deposited bits and pieces of the resolution to May's murder in the pages of her books. For example, this one, An Unnatural Death, which came out maybe a year and a half after May's murder, Dorothy includes a restroom scene that is almost exactly like the one that May and Celia McCarthy faced. And she provides a solution to that puzzle in it, which I will confess to using in The Queens of Crime. And all these books really have, it's almost like a trail of breadcrumbs that you have to follow to piece together the truth. And I also love the way Dorothy does this in many of her novels. She really addresses her outrage at the way that surplus women are depicted and treated. She really expresses her feelings about that in her books. She has her detectives rely upon a fictional bureau of bright, single working women, surplus women all, led by a woman named Miss Clemson. And this bureau assists in the investigations in Dorothy's books. They gather information that helps solve the crime because everyone underestimates the women. The 2 detectives, Harriet and Lord Peter Wimsey, they place these women in roles as secretaries, nurses, companions, governesses, and they scamper around gathering all this inside scoop that helps them solve the crime. And I love how that Dorothy takes this negative societal attitude about them as surplus women and uses it almost like a superpower. These women, it's like a disguise that allows these women to hide in plain sight and really crack the code of what's going on around them. I want to thank you guys so much for coming to listen to me talk about the Queens of Crime. I hope you enjoy it. I'd love to have you sign your books and chat with you guys about it. But I'd also love to take the opportunity to answer your questions. Yes, please yell.
I'll yell anyway. First of all, I just wanted to thank you so much for your books. I've read about a half a dozen so far and enjoyed them enormously. My question is, looking around, I can't help but notice that the population in the room is rather overwhelmingly female. That might, of course, be because there's some kind of a football game later on. But
we're not talking about that.
No.
No.
I'm curious, was the readership of the Queens of Crime back in the 30s and 40s largely female? Or
No.
was it? It was everybody. Yeah.
It was everybody. I mean, that's a great question. Something that nobody's asked me before. I really think that there's something about these, even today, these mysteries, which defies gender, right? There's something very attractive, and you know, it's interesting. I don't know if you guys know, there's really a resurgence in this classical murder mystery form today. It's kind of come back. It had faded for a while. What the murder mystery, or the mystery, classic mystery, allows you to do is you take a disordered world, you know, a world where something terrible and awry has happened, and a character comes in and sets things right. And that is a very appealing structure and form when you're dealing with a time period that is more tumultuous. So, you know, these classic murder mysteries really came into the forefront in the 1920s and 30s after what they called the Great War, World War I. They didn't know World War II was coming. But that war, I mean, it just rocked everybody's world. Nobody thought something like that was even possible. And they're still reeling in these years after World War I. And so these books were somehow satisfying because goodness could prevail. The justice could be delivered. And I think that is what made them popular across genres. And I actually think that's one of the reasons why they're popular again today. You know, there's a lot of tumultuousness in our world. Whatever your personal views or political views are, there's a lot of things that are uncertain. And I think certainly the pandemic rocked a lot of people's worlds. So all of that, I think, makes people very attracted to things where chaos does not prevail and order and justice does, if that makes sense. Thank you. Let's get your paper. I'm listening. Sorry. I will call on you if you don't ask questions. So just be ready for that. Yes.
So you said your aunt was a nun.
Yes.
I just recently heard that at one time nuns were kind of like like before their time feminists because they chose to do something else besides marrying. So I guess in a way they were a surplus woman. Do you think
Nice connection there. Did everybody see that? I love that. I'm going to use that.
will ever use your aunt as a character in a book, or has she been has a character been modeled on her in one of your previous books?
I have never been asked that question. That is such a good question.
Can you repeat it, please?
Yeah, should I repeat it? Would I, tell me if I get this right. Would I ever use my aunt, who was such an important figure in my life, would I ever use her as a character in one of my books? I haven't ever really thought about that, but now I have a little seed planted. I will say that her views, her love of literature. She introduced me to things that nobody I knew was reading at that time. You know, I was reading Toni Morrison, like nobody had ever heard of her when I was like in middle school. But she was also giving me like The Lord of the Rings, or if you guys have ever read The Mists of Avalon. Anyone here? I got a yes. I'm loving it. That was a female-centric retelling of the Arthurian legend, and that totally sent me on the path that I'm on today. So while I wouldn't say her life itself, but certainly her views, really her taste, really permeates a lot of what I do. But you are right that not all nuns, but a lot of nuns chose, and this goes way back, like, Middle Ages back, that was the only other option other than marriage and children. So if you wanted to be in a community where sometimes was the only way you could get an education, is if you went into the convent. So a lot of women who were looking for something different, who were looking for a modicum of independence, who were looking for a different path, would choose that. And in my aunt's time, there was a big wave for social justice and change in the convent, at least the one that she was in. And so they were very forward thinking. And so that's really what I mean. Like, she was doing things that at that time period that were very uncommon for women to do, if that makes any sense. So I love that question so much. I'm gonna think about that one. We're gonna answer a couple more questions, but can I ask you guys if I can take your picture? Would you guys mind? If you don't want to, just close your eyes. Put up your hands or your books or whatever you want. Thank you guys for indulging me. Okay, there was a question in the back that I saw. Was that you? Your hand? Oh, there. Okay, I'm sorry. And I'll get you next. Don't you worry.
Outside the Queen's Society, after all the research, is there a character that you are a particular violent for?
Now, I have 2 teenage sons, and that is like saying to me, which of the 2 do I prefer? I fall in love with these women when I'm researching them. I really feel like I'm not just their storytellers, but I'm their advocate. I know things about them that maybe nobody knew during their lifetime. Dorothy Sayers in particular had an enormous secret, which I do discuss in the book, and it was a doozy for the time. It would have completely ruined her life. So I do feel a certain protectiveness, I feel honor bound to give them this second chance to have their stories told. So, I do have this very strong feeling towards each one of them. And whoever I'm currently writing about is my favorite at that time. So, but I will say of all of them, there's one that I feel like an extra sense of tenderness towards. And I don't know if it's because she's the first one that I wrote about or because her situation was such, well, I'll tell you who she is. It was, if any of you have read The Other Einstein. Thank you for reading. If you haven't read that one, it's about Albert Einstein's first wife, who was a physicist herself, and they went to university together. She was one of the very first women to a university in a physics program, and I really do believe that she played a huge role in creating his theories, which really formed the foundation for modern day physics. And I don't want to give a spoiler, but let's just say by the end of that book, the way in which Albert has treated her has completely eviscerated the possibility that she will do the science that she loves. And I think, in part, I feel a lot of protectiveness towards her because of all the women I've written about. She's probably the one that her story, the things that occurred during her life, she wasn't able to seize back and really claw back and do what she was called to do. That was taken away from her. So I feel like she's maybe the most vulnerable, the one who didn't have her, she had such promise that was taken away from her too. I don't know what else she might have contributed to our world. So I do have this certain sense of protection towards her in a way that I don't towards the others. I wouldn't say she's my favorite, though, and don't quote me on that. There was one woman over here who was like waving. Okay, here we go.
Okay, hold on one second. Yeah, I'm looking at it. Thank you. Well, first of all, I gotta say that you have a huge fan from Bolivia, which is me.
Thank you.
I read all your books, and I feel like you are super talented.
Thank you.
And
that's so sweet.
I was wondering if you're currently working on a new project.
I always have a new project. I mean, I always say, like, it would be my great pleasure to say that, no, I'm not writing any more books because there are all women, justice has been restored to all women of the past. They have all been celebrated, right? For better or worse, there's no lack of material for me to write about. And there are so many women who deserve to have that light shined on them. My next book that comes out is called Daughter of Egypt. It comes out in about a year. And I haven't really perfected my soundbite on this one, so you guys, I'm going to test it out on you guys. How does that sound? So the daughter of, well, let me back up a second. Highclere Castle, which was upon which Downton Abbey is based, for many generations had been owned and run by the Carnarvon family. In the 1920s, Lord Carnarvon, head of the estate, had a daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. And Lady Evelyn had fallen in love with the thing that really propelled her father, which was Egyptian archaeology. And they worked hand in hand with an archaeologist by the name of Howard Carter to excavate Egypt every summer. And from a young age, Evelyn loved it. She was really tutored at home in it. And it was her great wish that they uncover the tomb of the only and most powerful female pharaoh. Her name was Hatshepsut. She had one of the greatest reigns in all of ancient Egypt, the most successful, the most peaceful. And yet, at her death, her name was literally chiseled out of every monument, every pyramid, every statue, every papyrus, such that archaeologists, historians, nobody knew she had ever existed, not for millennia. And the only way we ever found out about her is finally when the Rosetta Stone allowed us to translate hieroglyphics. There were some papyri that did not actually have her erased from history, and so people started to write her back in. Lady Evelyn Herbert was very desirous of finding Hatshepsut's tomb, and so they set out one season in the 1920s to uncover it. And what they uncovered instead was the tomb of Tutankhamun. If you're familiar with the story of the unearthing of King Tut's tomb, it was actually Lady Evelyn Herbert who was the first inside. She was the one who risked her life and crawled inside those tombs, and she was the first one to see all that blaze of gold. Now, of course, everyone else was super excited that they found that, but she was a little bit heartbroken because what she had been questing for was the story of the tomb of Hatshepsut. Woven into this story is the story of Hatshepsut. What I think, one of the greatest riddles that still exists today in ancient Egyptian history is, why was she eradicated from the historical record? Especially because she had one of the most successful reigns of all time. And where is her tomb? And those questions, I hope, are answered in that portion of the story which addresses her. So that comes out in a year. One more question? We have time maybe for one more? What do you think? One more, okay.
I was wondering, one of your books you co-wrote with and I'm wondering why you chose to have a co-author and how you met her and how what you got out of that collaboration.
Great, and we're going to make sure, I just clarify, those were like 3 questions, just to be sure. So for those of you who don't know, I've written 2, and I actually have a 3rd coming out, co-written projects with Victoria Christopher Murray. And they started with The Personal Librarian. For those of you who don't know it, The Personal Librarian is the story of J.P. Morgan, the famous industrialist. He had, and still has, one of the world's best collections of rare and priceless manuscripts. And he built his own personal library, which is a mammoth structure and exists today. And if you haven't been there, you really should go, because it is a jewel box. It is stunning. That is in New York City today. He hired her to help him run, and then really she became the creator of the collection. And when I was a lawyer, a commercial litigator in New York City for a decade before I started writing books, and I would sneak out. I knew it wasn't what I was supposed to be doing, and I would sneak out of work during the day and go to the different cultural institutions in New York, and the Morgan was one of them. Has anyone here been to it? Oh my gosh, a lot of you guys, I love that. So it's like a time portal. It is literally frozen in time from when, the original they've built on a whole museum to the side of it, but the original library looks exactly like it did. And I used to love to go there and just imagine a different life, right? And one day when I was there, I happened to meet a docent. This was many decades ago. I happened to meet a docent who told me that this incredible collection and institution really hadn't been just J.P. Morgan's doing. His librarian had really been instrumental, and it was a woman, Belle Costa Green. And I thought, my God, that's fascinating. That was early 1900s. That was a time when women didn't have the right to vote, and then I became interested in her, and I learned so much about what she did to really transform that particular area of art, but also libraries in general. She was the first person to come up with the idea of visiting collections. Nobody had done that. So many things really are, the library world is beholden to her. But it wasn't for like maybe 10 years after that, when I could feel her like standing in the corner of a room, like, when are you gonna get to my story, lady? It was around that time that we learned that she was actually a black woman passing as white. That nobody knew that, or it hadn't been confirmed when I first came across her. Certainly the docent who told me about her didn't know that about her. It was her heavily guarded secret and would have destroyed her life and the life of her entire family if that had come out. She was actually the daughter of a very famous, the first black graduate of Harvard and an activist for equality. But then the tides turned and Jim Crow laws came to rule the land, and she wouldn't have even been allowed in the institution that she ran if people knew about her real identity. It was at that point that I really came to believe that Belle Costa Green deserved her story to be told by a black woman as well. Really for two reasons. First of all, I can imagine a lot of things, and I do. If you guys have read my books, you know I imagine a lot of things. I can't really imagine what it would be like to be a black person in our society, you know? And I also felt poor Belle Costa Green had to hide her true identity for all that time. Didn't she deserve to have a black person have a hand in her story as well? So it was at that time that I met Victoria. She had never written historical fiction before. And she had written a contemporary novel that I thought was kind of exploring some of these issues in a similar way, but from a contemporary perspective. And I asked her if she wanted to work with me on The Personal Librarian, and she did. And that's my long story for today. Did that answer 3 questions? One more?
You can do one
Okay.
more.
Okay, go ahead, yes.
I just want to comment that I was supposed to hear you and Victoria speak together up in Cleveland several years ago, but you were sick.
Oh my gosh, I remember. You are so, thank you for your patience. Thank you.
But it was interesting. She talked a lot about your creative process and how you two collaborated during COVID. I mean, she was wonderful.
Aww.
To see you together.
Oh, we do have fun doing it together. Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, so I was kind of used to coming out and talking to people with my little PowerPoints and stuff. And then I'm like, oh, I could do this with another person? This is fun. So we do have a blast. And it's fun to see us together, for us to talk about the way we collaborate. And it's a little different for every book. You know, with our first 2 books, The First Ladies and The Personal Librarian, are very different books. And so we had to be nimble in the process. And our 3rd book, which I can't say what it is because we haven't announced it yet, that book, again, is different too. So it's been so transformative for me, not just as a writer, but as a person, to work on these projects with Victoria. I feel very fortunate. Very fortunate.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Marie Benedict will be in the library's rotunda. If you just come out the doors here and into the library, we'll have a line formed. You can meet her briefly. She has a plane to catch this afternoon, so briefly get to meet her and have her book signed if you purchased. If you have not yet purchased a book, The Learned Owl is still selling books out in the rotunda. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for joining me.